Hello. Today, I figured I'd start a series of a few videos having to do with having a nuanced way of explaining agential systems, and in large part that has to do with biological organisms, primarily because as of now, we science the advances in the sciences hasn't gotten us to artificial agential systems quite yet, but I figured I'd provide an understanding of what are agents and kind of go over a little bit leading into that. First, understanding, okay, what can let's build off of classical electrical circuits and how computer systems work. So let me get a graphic here. So let's first talk about computer systems in the most general sense. Now, a quick Google search of inputs and outputs leads me to some interesting graphics here, right? And I think you guys can see my mouse hovering some of these graphics. And essentially, the way computers work is take some input, process that input, and provide an output, right? And the output is presented to us, the users engaging with these systems, which, by the way, are composed of electrical circuit architectures. So a quick Google search of that. I'm not going to click any of the links. Try not to. I'm a bit skeptical of uploading a video and clicking on a link and then not providing enough information on the link I shared. So a quick Google search, right? We take a look at how these circuits are constructed. And the way that these circuits are constructed is based off binary operations. So if we take a look, and hopefully this we have these binary operations here. We're going to do a zoom in a little bit. Zoom in a little bit more. And see if we find something. Okay, so right over here, we have these with this bitwise operator truth table. Now, the very basic operators that we're concerned with is an AND or an OR operator. And there's also an XOR operator or exclusive OR operator. So the AND operator, as we can see, 0 is going to represent false, true is going to represent 0 is going to represent false, 1 is going to represent true. And for our AND operator to evaluate as true, basically we need two 1s. So at the bottom here of this truth table, I have 1 and 1 for x and y yields 1. Okay. Otherwise, we have 0. So 0 reveals false. And then the OR operator is 1, either x or y needs to be 0 or 1. So we see that, okay, we have x is 0, y is 1, therefore x or y is 1, and then, of course, we reverse that, x is 1, y is 0. And if they're both 1, well, that's also true. If they're both false, then that means they're false because it's neither one or the other. So we have this classical logic system here, which is the foundation of how binary operations play out in these classical circuit architectures that we find encoded in the computers that we use day to day, these classical computer systems. Now, there's computer systems out there like quantum computer systems and photonic computer systems. The problem being that they're not at the level of commerciability for the general consumer that utilizes these classical computer systems, like the phones we have and the personal computers and the tablet devices most of us are familiar with are based on these classical electrical circuit architectures that encode these binary operations in some fashion. And these encodings here, we get these circuit architectures, right? And there's a number of examples here. Let's classical, because it's showing us some architectures that aren't quite classical, right? Now there's different types of components for circuits. We're not going to get into those. Basically, you are with these different circuit components, and we see a number of interesting diagrams here, some interesting graphics here. A number of these circuit components, what they do is they regulate the current flow. That current flow is the signal, is the dynamics of the signal being regulated through the circuit that has to do with the flow of inputs to outputs. So that's what you get here with these classical electrical circuits. You get these binary operational encodings where you take in information, you store it somewhere in the circuit, does some computation or calculation rather with these binary operations, and that's how we are able to store and retrieve memory in the computers we use, and have presented out, like have that memory, that information presented to us as an output, right? So essentially that's what we get with these classical circuit architectures, and we get these inputs and these outputs, right? There's the processing of the inputs to the outputs. Okay, so in regards to getting these inputs with these classical circuits, we have these sensors that signal that information is coming in, or certain types of information is being passed on through the circuit to other components. That would you basically have these sensors, these sensor components, and these actuator components. So the sensors, you can think of them as, okay, the sensors take in some input, they might pass it along to another specialized sensor, and then it might keep passing along to some point until there is some component, there can be some operation, there can be some action performed, right? And this action is facilitated by an actuator. So the actuator is this component within these circuits that is basically a response to the input to do some calculation. And actually, you can think of some of these, like at some point, some of these sensors have some actuation involved. Maybe not as much actuation, but that we tend to think of okay, take in the input, produce the output, or take in the input, do some behavior that is some facilitated result of the system engaging with some information, and then the outcome of that engagement, right? So at some point there's going to be some actions performed on the information coming in as an input into the circuit, and that output is facilitated back to us. Now, throughout this whole process with these types of circuits, the system doesn't have a mind of its own. It's not aware of the information coming in and out in the ways that we are, in the ways that our anatomy is wired and how our brains work in terms of being able to interpret our environment and react to stimuli. That's a whole different dynamic and a whole different system. These electrical circuit-based architectures based on classical logic operations, these binary operations, are limited in the aspect that we encode them with instructions to take in some input and produce some output. And between the input and the output, there's this processing of information, right? And so we could see a number of these graphics here show that there's an intermediary processing step involved. Now, okay. So these computers that we're so used to utilizing to engage with the internet and each other, these systems are encoded in a way that they're not aware of of really what they're interacting with, where they're just encoded, they're programmed for us to utilize. If nobody's engaging with these systems, they're just idle, doing nothing, providing no value. The value in utilizing these systems is us engaging with them, because these systems are designed for us to engage with them. Otherwise, they're just not going to do anything, right? They're very primitively programmed in such a way. They take some input that we feed them, they produce an output, so the system's always relying on a user to engage with it in that respect. Okay, now let's move on to from these very primitive classical electrical circuit-based computer systems to understanding what is an agent, what is an agential system, and this is a big jump, right? Now, I brought up the term sensor and actuator. These are still important components in terms of how agential systems work, or systems with agency. Now, considering systems with agency, you have a system that is constantly engaging with stimulus and responding to that stimulus. The sensor dynamics of the system is the part of the system that deals with the engagement of stimulus. So you can think of like first contact with stimulus in some degree, whether it's the internal the internalized engagement of a stimulus, or rather it's external stimulus bombarding the system itself, where the stimulus is being fed towards the system, and the system is interpreting the stimulus in a certain manner. Now, the manner in which the stimulus is being engaged with is, we can call this what I like to call the PAP-cycle, the PAP-cycle. So there is perceiving the stimulus, or perception, where an agent is exploring its environment and trying to make sense of what it's directly engaging with. And what it's directly engaging with is we can consider the stimulus of the system or agent in question. Then we have an action. The action is some response to a stimulus, whether it's internalized or there's this, well, at some point the stimulus is internalized, and then there's some action that the system takes as an agent. Then there is an experience, right? We have to consider prior experience. So PAP, perception, action, prior, or priors. Priors standing for prior experience that the system references in terms of the history of perceptions and actions of the system as an agent. And these dynamics are regulated based on, when we consider biological organisms as agents, how we as biological organisms have evolved to adapt to how we perceive and act and develop these priors. So maybe there's a graphic I can show here. Oh, we'll keep these in. Maybe this input-output stuff might be relevant. Another thing to keep in mind before I close this binary operators page is that these agential systems don't necessarily rely on classical logic operations, especially, well, we can call these binary operations or classical logic operations, especially to be denoted as Boolean logic or Boolean operations. But the way agents engage with their environment is extended from classical operations to non-classical logical operations. So operations dealing with fuzzy logic, paraconsistent logic, or just really superpositional behavior of a system that contends with evaluating evaluating its parameters, evaluating what's fed into the system. So let's take a look. Maybe I'll keep this open. So agents, perception, action, priors. Let's see if we could get something here. See if there's something nice here. And I'm not going to click anything in particular. What I looked for, I did a Google search on agents, perception, action, priors. Right, so we mentioned sensors, we mentioned actuators, and now agents, we can when we're referring to biological organisms as agents, there's two main categories of agents that we can consider. We can consider agents in the singular sense, as unit cells. Cells themselves are capable of agency because they perceive, they act, and they have this experience of engaging with their environment, even though it's quite simplistic compared to when we consider multicellular systems, which would then be multi-agent systems. I said it right. Now, these multi-agent systems composed of multiple cells engaging, cooperating, coordinating with each other. And we can think of ourselves, humans, as these multi-agent systems that rely on the integrity of the anatomical subsystems in which these unit cellular agents compose the entire anatomy thereof. We can think of the unit cells as from the bottom up, and then you can think of executive functioning dynamics from the top down. And different types of cells regulate different subsystems, right? So, not only do we have this engagement, which we consider perceptions, actions, and priors, so agents engage with stimulus. At some point, that stimulus is internalized to some degree, in varying degrees, depending on the stimulus. And then, of course, certain stimulus have to be internalized to certain degrees before appropriate actions unfold, where we consider the actions to be related to actuators. But also, we can think of the internalized sensory dynamics to have some actuation involved, where there's interpretation of the stimulus to different degrees in terms of the layers of perception involved. Like, consider thoughts as opposed to the acting out behaviors that we have, in which the acting out has more of a impact on the external environment in which we as agents are embedded in. So agents are embedded in some environment that they are constantly navigating and trying to optimize and leverage fitness as best as they can. Now, in my work, that in the publication work I'm doing on habit-forming behavior and adaptive learning, agents can engage with their external environment and deal with stimuli intrinsically and internally in one of two ways. In a way that reinforces fitness, so optimizing the agent in question, their capacity to sustain their current state of integrity, or at least leverage a state near to that state, which is still optimal but maybe becomes suboptimal over time. And we see, like, given cellular senescence in biology, that eventually agents, they have more, over time, they develop suboptimal behaviors as opposed to more optimal behaviors they had in the previous state of time. And this might be a problem with agential systems in general, that due to aging dynamics, even of an artificial system, that agents just become less and less competent at the tasks that they're specialized in doing or coordinating with other agents. Now, okay, let's think about making sense of this internalization of how agents leverage fitness in terms of the top-down processes. When we think about more complex agents such as ourselves, human beings, multi-agent systems, or we can think of, okay, even near general intelligence systems, we consider us humans to be general intelligence systems, that we have this capacity of self-awareness, of engaging with the environment and internalizing that engagement within ourselves and developing experience based on this capacity of learning being this fundamental capacity to explore our environment and internalize. So extrinsically, we're exploring our environment. Intrinsically, we're also exploring thought process and decision-making dynamics of evaluating how we perceive the world around us. So we have this world model, and we go from that to having these prior experiences that we evaluate future criteria of decisions and thoughts that we have. So from there, the process of making decisions can be more trivial or becomes a non-trivial process. And in the more trivial cases where decisions aren't so difficult to perform, referring to Daniel Kahneman's System 1 and System 2 processes, System 1 represents the process, the kind of decisions that feel more natural and automatic to us, as opposed to System 2. System 2 processes feel more so that they take effort, that we have to that we have to really think things out before we really come to a result of what decision ought to be made and how that has an impact on our actions and our prior experiences based on what we perceive. Now, the problem with these System 2 processes is that we need to weigh the decisions in some capacity, because the dynamics in which we approach an outcome being non-trivial, it involves, okay, we need to evaluate this non-triviality. So affective processing becomes important. This capacity of feeling sensations. So this capacity to internalize stimuli leads to this stimuli being interpreted as a sensation of some sort. And there's many ways that we sense the world around us: through touch, through vision, through what we hear, so auditory, visual, kinesthetic, so touching, and tasting, smelling. These are different ways, these are very rudimentary ways that we can develop some generalization of the sensations that we experience. And at some point, these sensations, these visceral, so at this point, these sensations are visceral in the sense that we are experiencing these sensations in the moment. And at some point, those momentary processing of sensations leads to some means to how we feel about handling the load of those sensations. And then that leads to this affective component, or this emotional, like this idea of emotions, that we have this, we feel some way about the stimuli we are internalizing and reacting to, as well as the experience over time, the history of the engagement of stimuli responding to the stimuli. So on one hand, there is the experience of feeling, this in the visceral sense, which eventually translates to a more general feeling state, which can better be interpreted as emotions. But these emotions are kind of like weights for the logical deductions we make in trying to interpret and evaluate a decision, or a thought process rather, that guides our history of perceiving and acting. So we have this, and we form these memories based on how we perceive and act with our environment, and adaptation through this sense of learning boils down to, okay, well, there's a constructive, intuitive way that I can leverage fitness better in the long run, even though eventually my way of leveraging like the capacity to leverage fitness due to aging as a biological organism, as an agent, becomes more suboptimal over time. Reinforcement learning is this constructive capacity to deal with this in the most optimal fashion. On the other hand, the opposing of this would be maladaptive learning, or maladaptive behavior. So on the one hand, we have reinforcement learning, or reinforcement-based behavior. On the other hand, we have maladaptive based behavior, in which we are evaluating these in the moment processing and engagement of stimuli that's being internalized. And on the one hand, there might be certain moments where the thought process and decision-based processing involved here is more trivial as opposed to non-trivial. But I think a good analogy to couple with Daniel Kahneman's System 1 and System 2 processing is Jonathan Haidt's the rider and the elephant analogy. Now, you can think of the rider as sort of the voice of reason guiding the elephant, and the elephant is just experiencing the world, taking it all in. The elephant represents this capacity of experiencing and taking it all in, and one could only imagine an elephant going rampant and just out of control, and there's in the middle of a village, right? Nobody wants that. The rider has to have a good grip on the elephant. So I think this analogy couples well with Daniel Kahneman's System 1 and System 2 processing analogy. Now, okay. I don't think I clarified this earlier, but embodiment, or what we better understand as embodied cognition, what separates us from machines, is this capacity to internalize the stimulus, which is some compositional dynamic of this external environment that we have to deal with, right? That we're constantly engaging with. And this constant engagement is learning itself, that we're constantly updating our world model, trying to figure out, okay, how am I going to leverage fitness? What are the optimality based ways I can engage, I can internalize the stimuli and leverage fitness, right? Because that matters in terms of survival, right? For agents in general, especially when we think of biological organisms as agents. So embodiment has to do with taking these, like the capacity to internalize sensations in multiple modalities in a way that's not restricted to how these basic electrical circuit architectures that computers utilize work. Because now we're getting to a whole different architecture that utilizes ion channels, electrolytes, and minerals as resources to leverage the dynamics of internalizing and reacting to these sensations, right? So we think about how electrical circuits work. The problem is I have a power source, and the power source for a basic electrical circuit, right? It is like your standard battery for your iPhone, right? You gotta charge your phone every so often, and you plug it into a wall. You have a desktop computer. That thing ain't gonna run unless you keep it plugged into a wall where it's gonna get this raw electrical signal. And that does us as agential systems no good, because we need more than just a raw electrical signal for our system to operate the way it does. We need multiple sources of breaking down variable energy, right? Because we have all these different minerals and electrolytes that our bodies rely on through a metabolic system. And metabolically, our bodies break down all these sources of energy in order to maintain the functional integrity it has. At least until cellular senescence becomes a real problem in the long run in terms of aging. And perhaps this is restricted to biological organisms as agents. And maybe it might not carry on to artificial agents, but we know that unicellular and multicellular systems, if we think of single unit agents as opposed to multi-unit agents or multi-agent systems, these systems rely on metabolic processing. And that's the power source. The power source is metabolic processing. I mean, even our basic computer architectures wear down over time based on how long they're used and how much, the amount of energy it takes for certain processing over time. Right? That has to be taken into effect, right? So eventually electrical computer systems we're used to and know and love wear down actually quicker. They wear down quicker than our system does. But ultimately, we as biological organisms, as agents, we wear down too. Okay, well, a lot of you are watching this video thinking, okay, well, what am I getting out of this? What does this have to do with consciousness as embodiment? And, well, let's be more specific about what consciousness means. And the reason I made this video for a couple reasons. The first reason being that I feel that I'm rather surprised that there's still this whole talk about consciousness and we haven't resolved it yet. And I think we have enough information to resolve what consciousness means. And pertaining to that, and I'll put a couple of video links and maybe some papers that might be useful to digest pertaining to consciousness. And what got me leaning towards embodiment regarding consciousness would be points made in the Theories of Everything episode featuring Anand Vaidya, which I'll link that in the description, in terms of what separates agential systems and electrical circuits, where, okay, wow, there's these non-classical logical deductions being made with human decision making, and it's not just human decision making, but agential based decision making in general, because you're exploring a whole environment that extends beyond binary operations, right? These agents have to explore a multi-dimensional environment or a multi-parameter environment, right? And metabolism functions in a multi-dimensional fashion of harnessing different sources of energy to do different types of compute. And a lot of these types of compute, in terms of non-triviality, especially with top-down executive functioning decision-making, for us humans as agents, this results in non-classical logic operations, right? Where we consider the effective processing of emotions as decision weights when thinking gets hard, and we are dealing with non-triviality in System 2 thinking, as opposed to System 1 thinking, where the decision making just feels so natural and intuitive, and it doesn't seem problematic, and we're not at a fork in the road. Getting back to consciousness now, so the traditional way consciousness has been discussed and debated is talking about what it means for me to experience what is it like to experience life as a bird or someone else? What is it like for me to experience being someone else or being something else? And I think that dodges the dynamics of, okay, that's really just a subjective experience, right? We take someone else as subject and their experience as opposed to my experience. That's not to say that our experiences are totally reducible. Of course, our experiences there are some aspects that we will never fully understand someone else's experience, because that's their experience from their physiology and their exposure to just life experiences. So there's no way I can fully understand or comprehend another person's life experiences and physiological anomalies. And to some degree, that's going to be irreducible, which is a problem in understanding behavior of agents and how agents vary from one another, especially in complexity, in terms of comparing, okay, well, how do we compare humans to other types of agents or organisms, right? In terms of the fitness advantages that we have opposed to other organisms. Okay, so I think this is kind of, unfortunately, it doesn't really get to the point. But, okay, this subjective experience is really subjective experience. It's not really addressing consciousness. Okay, so how then do we address consciousness? Well, if we go back to what embodiment means, like how we are engaging with the world around us, and we're internalizing this engagement. To be more specific, this seems to be, and this is going towards Michael Graziano's perspective of addressing the problem of consciousness, having to do with attention, the dynamics of attention, how, and there's so many. I mean, there's multiple ways in which attention dynamics are regulated in cognitive function, and there's no single way we can isolate attention, because attention is context specific. But if we isolate the dynamics of attention to different reference frames, moment by moment, and we recall an experience, it's like, oh, okay, I'm just watching somebody cross the street, or I'm having this feeling of squeezing a stress ball in my hand, and I could describe this feeling in the moment, and the very dynamics involved in squeezing the ball, whether, having to do with my hands contracting to squeeze the ball, and then letting go to let the ball kind of go back into its original shape before I squeezed it into this deformed shape. If we isolate the frames in the moment of the experience of these sensations, which we consider, okay, well, this is embodiment. But then we can isolate the embodied reference frames. We can isolate the moment-by-moment frames of embodiment as different reference frames in the moment. The trick being, of course, is that every time I try to explain the experience I'm having, that experience already happened, right? But I can make reference to that experience that just happened, or explaining that experience of squeezing the ball as, okay, there was a moment that I was having this sensation of squeezing the ball in my hands, and I perceived the squeezing of the ball a certain way in terms of the sensations I was feeling and the thought process I was having, which impacts, of course, this perception, action, and prior dynamic, which, again, I like to call the PAP, or the PAP-cycle. So we can think of, so I think, and I've just started talking to people about this aspect of, okay, well, what if we consider consciousness as embodiment itself, but not just the generalization of embodiment, but if we take moment-to-moment isolated reference frames of embodiment in terms of, okay, this was me being aware of squeezing the stress ball at a certain moment for a certain period, and I have this sense of awareness, these sensations of squeezing the stress ball, right? And this is an embodied experience. I think that gets, I think that gets more to the point of, okay, how can we have an understanding of what consciousness means if we look at the dynamics of attention. We take the dynamics of attention and relate the attentional dynamics of experience based on the sensations that we are trying to interpret moment by moment, leads us to this understanding of consciousness as embodied. So I think that this kind of goes into the woods of what I wanted to cover for this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time in this short series of videos. I hope it was an exciting experience, and I'll see you again.